Okay, hi, hello, welcome back. My name is Devraj. This is Mysticism in the Body, and today I want to start looking at the cornerstone Rosicrucian document, Fama Fraternitatis. And I think this document is fascinating on several different levels. For a start, it created a huge furore when it came out, in the early 1600s, around 1614, originally published in German, later translated into Latin and English. But it created a huge stir. There was quite a kind of there was at the time quite a burgeoning mystical scene in Europe, with various alchemists writing books, guys like John Dee travelling around, who was high up in the Elizabethan court as a mathematician. And so there was quite an interest in esoteric things at that time. The scientific enlightenment hadn't really got going at that point. So this idea that we now have of there being like a firm boundary between something mystical and something that's kind of bona fide science, that boundary was a lot more diffuse at that time. If you're a well-to-do person of that era, you were probably equally interested in like alchemy and mysticism as much as you were concepts that were coming out in science, what we would now consider to be, mainstream hardline science. And then essentially what happened when this document came out was it created a massive stir. It's not particularly long, about 10 pages, something like that, but it created a huge stir because it's obviously an allegorical tale. It makes it very obvious that it's allegorical by saying certain things which are a bit nonsensical. And then the publication of this Fama Fraternitatis also fed into an idea that was kind of getting popular at the time, the idea that there was an invisible college or an invisible university. We've also come across this in our look at the Zohar, and the idea with this invisible school or invisible college, invisible university, was that it was like a secret group of learned men who knew the deepest kind of mysteries of existence. But because these mysteries were so powerful, they needed to keep themselves together and, not talk about this stuff or put it out too much. This was a very popular concept at the time. This picture later became identified with the Rosicrucian movement, and it's meant to depict this kind of invisible, movable, hidden college. And later on, I think a leading scientist in the mid-1600s, Robert Boyle, made some statements about our invisible college, which fanned the flames even more. But this picture was around, this idea of an invisible college of secret learned men was around in the early 1600s. And then when this Fama Fraternitatis document was released, originally in German, like I said, this fanned the flames even more. That this was like, now this mysterious invisible college were kind of coming out and putting out their kind of manifesto, but in an allegorical form. So this created a huge furore, with everyone and his mother trying to dig into this manifesto and work out what it was about, and also then kind of print their own interpretations or their own work in the hope that the invisible college would contact them, invite them to be a member. And it's worth noting, whilst it might sound far-fetched perhaps to some people, this concept of the invisible college remained powerful and remains powerful to this day. Many people still seek it. Aleister Crowley was very motivated by this in his early career. Western esoteric organizations typically have like a third order. You're a kind of beginner, then you join the first order, second order, then the third order is like hidden from view, invite only. These people who are either kind of part human, part dwelling on the astral realm because of their level of spiritual advancement or whatever. It's shrouded in mystery. The apex is in a lot of mystery. So these concepts are still prevalent today and still motivating people's behavior. And what happened here was this document came out, the Fama Fraternitatis. If you want to look at it online, you can find it on the alchemywebsite.com. Just look for Fama. And then about a year after that, a document called the Confessio came out, which was a bit less interesting in some ways, though it had a very interesting preamble which explained that, soon, we've had to keep this stuff hidden, but soon we're going to be able to just, the times will have changed, the Inquisition has gone, there's going to be a time of religious freedom coming, hopefully, and we can really shout out, we can shout out the stuff that we've previously had to keep secret. So this was the concept very much in these two documents. A couple of years later, another document called The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosicrucians came out, and this kind of split the scene in some ways, and that split lasts to this day, with some people saying that it's part of the same series, other people saying it's really not. And because the Chemical Wedding document was traced to Johannes Andre, a German writer, and a lot of it he'd written before when he was like a teenager, I think. For some people, it became a central work of alchemy. For others, they really dismissed it and said that it's not important and it's really not a part of the Rosicrucian documents, and that only the Fama and the Confessio are the two central documents. So we're about 1615 in Europe. There's been this sense of this hidden university somewhere. This document's come out, which has even fanned the flames more. There's also a sense in the air that, Reformation is happening. You've had Martin Luther, you've had John Calvin, King Henry VIII, because he wanted to get a divorce, and the Catholic Pope wouldn't allow him to have a divorce. He created the Church of England. So there's this sense in the air of huge change. And as it happened, it didn't really happen because, the Catholics came back in, the Habsburgs, a very powerful family in Europe came in, and there was the 30 Years' War, and it all ended up in a mess. But around about the time, of 1610, 1620, there was this sense in the air that, like, wow, we can really create a much more free and open society, and we can reveal all these deep mystical secrets. So it didn't go that way, but that was a distinct phase of history, and in some ways, it's been a little bit similar now, I think. It's been a little bit similar, this sense that we could have this big kind of decentralized freedom where we can move a bit further away from the family system, chop back the patriarchy a little bit and that kind of thing. Certainly in the West, that's been the impression, and with other cultures outside of the West that lean into the West and observe what's going on, this idea of a new freedom coming, it's still there in people's minds, in their hearts. And of course, things are shifting geopolitically and maybe it's going in a different direction. So I think it's a similar time. It's a similar time 400 years later where we've kind of come back to a similar kind of phase of history with this immense promise. And included in that is this idea that secrets that have had to be kept hidden can now be revealed. So the Fama Fraternitatis, like I say, written in German, and it wasn't published in English, I don't think, formally, until about the 1650s, so some 40 years later, when a translation was done by a guy called Thomas Vaughan, who was a famous Welsh alchemist and generally highly regarded. And I imagine the delay was caused in part by the 30 Years' War. What I'm going to be looking at in the next couple of programs on the Fama is the original text, then also some of my own understanding of it, and also an interpretation from this guy, Paul Foster Case, who wrote a book, The True and Invisible Rosicrucian Order, I think in the 1940s originally. You can still find that online, it's still in publication. He was the head of the builders of the Adytum, and it was known that he was his kind of inner connection, so to speak, with this notion of with the invisible college was through a guy called Master R, also known as the Comte Saint-Germain, who he believed he was channeling and that he'd met in the 1920s as well, and had given him instructions for his own esoteric order. And certainly for me, when I came across this book about 25 years ago, I found it absolutely fascinating. Essentially, you get a bit of introduction, and then it goes through. It gives you the actual document. It dismisses the Chemical Wedding document, completely. It's quite brutal about that. Then it talks a bit about Rosicrucianism, and then you've got gives you the actual text of the Fama, and then it gives you the text of the Confessio, the Confession of a Rosicrucian Fraternity, the two cornerstone documents. So it gives you the English translations done by Thomas Vaughan. And then it goes into some lengthy kind of discourses on what the material's really about. So this is a fascinating book and well worth reading. I mean, the rumor was that Dr. Case was like some kind of high up Kabbalistic rabbi in a former life, and that would make sense because he does kind of give a lot of Kabbalah at times, maybe a little bit over the top, and in a manner that isn't always entirely convincing, because you have the feeling that the associations he's drawing could be drawn in multiple different directions, to be honest. Because if you get deeply into the numerology behind Kabbalah, you find that pretty much any number could be interpreted in any number of ways and links to all sorts of other things. And whilst that can be useful to have that in your mind, it's not always so convincing when you try to make hard claims about what, say, a text or its numerology means, because it's clear that there could be any other number of other meanings and you could make it mean pretty much anything. And that is a drawback of this very heavy numerological approach. But that aside, there's a lot of very fascinating stuff in this, and I found this book completely fascinating when I first read it, like about 2000, 2002 or whatever. Okay, so that's a bit of preamble. Let's get to the text of the Fama and make a start. Fama Fraternitatis of the Meritorious Order of the Rosy Cross, addressed to the learned in general and the governors of Europe. And then it starts, seeing the only wise and merciful God in these latter days have poured out so richly his mercy and goodness to mankind, whereby we do attain more and more to the perfect knowledge of his Son Jesus Christ and of nature, that justly we may boast of the happy time wherein there is not only discovered unto us the half part of the world, which was hitherto unknown and hidden, but he hath also made manifest unto us many wonderful and never heretofore seen works and creatures of nature, and moreover hath raised men endued with great wisdom, which might partly renew and reduce all arts in this our spotted and imperfect age to perfection, so that man might thereby understand his own nobleness and worth, and why he is called microcosmos, and how far his knowledge extendeth in nature. So that's a very long sentence to get going with. Reminds me a little bit of, not as bad as Gurdjieff, Beelzebub's tales to his grandson or something, but it's a very long statement, but it's got sort of interesting things in it which are really worth noting. Bear in mind it's a translation from German, nevertheless, saying the only wise and merciful God. So that's interesting. It's kind of implying a little bit like Jewish Kabbalah and some of the Zohar we've been looking at, that there isn't just one God. You have this very simplistic Christian vision of kind of God in the Bible, Elohim. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. But when you look at that text, from the perspective of the Zohar, the Jewish mystical book, it's more like God isn't created in the beginning. God comes up a little bit later. So tacking into this, we've got this Rosicrucian statement saying the only wise and merciful God. So it's like there's other gods around, but this is the good one. So that's one thing you can pick up. The second that you can pick up is this idea, more to the perfect knowledge of his Son, Jesus Christ. So already having made a vaguely kind of potentially sort of anti-Catholic kind of statement, or generally anti-Christian, implying there's more than one God, we go back a bit and say, well, the Son, Jesus Christ, is still, he's the perfect man. And generally it is understood that by the Rosicrucians schools that Christ is the central figure who's holding it all at some deep level. But it also says the most perfect knowledge of his Son, Jesus Christ, and of nature. So this is a very dominant theme in the Fama, this idea of nature, often referred to as the Liber M or Liber Mundi, the book of the world. And the basic concept is that the natural world around us, we see it a certain way, but actually it's like a book that if we learn how to read it, we can develop ourselves very deeply and we can come to understand mystical secrets. Not because the book just tells us to them, but because it gives us a way of understanding the world such that we can go deeper inside ourselves. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. So the idea is that, when you learn to read the Liber M, the Liber Mundi, the book of the world, then you can go deep inside yourself. So it's already coming up. And then straight away, you see this idea that we justly boast of a happy time wherein there is not only discovered unto us the half part of the world, which was hitherto unknown and hidden. So that's, again, referring to this idea that the Liber M, nature, the natural world, is actually a book from which we can learn. And relating to that, you can consider how the typical individual sees themselves as individual body and agent surrounded by an external world. It's making a kind of statement about that. But there are things hidden around us. That's a theme that I looked at also in the opening passages of Liber Au. So these works are all kind of similar. And it's also, and what I started to say there was, that there's going to be a happy time soon, a general reformation, there's going to be a change in religion. The more brutal factions of religion are going to subside, and there's going to be a lot more religious freedom for people. So it's saying essentially in the rest of this sentence, this very long sentence, that things are really, really going to improve. A lot of secrets can come out, and men can discover all this amazing wisdom that's been hidden for so long. And then we've got a second paragraph before we kind of get going with the main part of the text. Let's just have a quick look there. Although the rude world herewith will be but little pleased, but rather smile and scoff thereat, also the pride and covetousness of the learned is so great it will not suffer them to agree together. But were they united, they might out of all those things which in our age God doth so richly bestow upon us, collect librum naturae, or a perfect method of all arts. Shorter sentence. So basically what it's saying is, everyone's going to laugh at you if you say you're part of that there's all this hidden knowledge. You say there's all this hidden knowledge, particularly if you claim that you might have some of it because the pride and covetousness of the learned is so great. There's this egoic competition. This comes out often. I remember listening to the modern day occultist or esoteric chap, Alan Chapman, talking recently about when he kind of had a phase when he told people in his chaos magic group that he was actually enlightened. He gets a lot of pushback both from the kind of Buddhist enlightenment scene and the other esoterics, because they see this as he's given himself an accolade and he's implying that he's better than them. And so this kind of primate part of the brain reacts and pushes back, and you're not enlightened, mate, you're talking a load of rubbish or whatever. And that's what the farmer's talking about here, basically. They won't agree together. They're all fighting about ideas. And you can see this now for sure. I think in many ways we are in a similar era. If you ever come across the concept of like The Cathedral, written by a rather, not a writer I follow a lot, Curtis Yarvin. I'm not massively into his kind of stuff, but I thought his concept of the cathedral was very interesting, where all the whole of academia is all backing itself up. It's just in this vast kind of cathedral-like structure where it's singing its own praises, and people who are suitable come up to be academics, to be in science or the humanities or whatever. It's just this vast kind of structure, and it's really quite detached from the actual investigation that is supposed to be at the heart of academia. Instead of investigating what's going on really in the world, in nature and all this kind of thing, it's become a kind of primate status signaling hierarchical structure. So, it's picking this concept up here. That instead of fighting amongst each other and getting involved in all these status games, the learned, what they could be doing is making use of all the gifts which in our age God doth so richly bestow on us. Collect librum naturae, which I think is to do with the philosopher's stone, or a perfect method of all arts. Again, it's going into, how to use nature to enlighten yourself and to create the philosopher's stone, a regenerated pineal gland. Let us continue. But such is their opposition that they still keep and are loath to leave the old course. So again, talking about, it's like the cathedral, esteeming Porphyry, Aristotle and Galen, yea, and that which hath but mere show of learning, more than the clear and manifested light and truth. So once again, it's coming back to this idea of academia, the cathedral. You can see it was still dominant at that time. All these supposedly learning men, supporting each other and bigging up their latest books and papers and the peer review process as it is now. And that's really got very, very little to do with actually investigating on a sincere, open-hearted level what's happening in the world, what nature really is. Those, if they were now living with much joy, would leave their erroneous doctrines. So it's talking about Porphyry, famous Neoplatonist, Aristotle and Galen. Galen was something big in medicine, possibly in Greece. Should know that. But, and he's saying that if these guys were now living, they're the kind of guys. So it's kind of slagged them a little bit here in this sentence. Then it's pulling it back a bit to say, if these guys were now living, they would be fascinated in this stuff. They'd be fascinated in the invisible college and what it's investigating in nature, in the Liber M. But here is too much weakness for such a great work. So it's saying the people are just too weak. You know, the intellectuals of the modern time, most of them are just too weak, and all they want to do is get in their little hierarchy and maintain it. And although in theology, medicine and mathematics the true stuff opposes itself, nevertheless the old enemy, by his subtlety and craft, doth show himself in hindering every good purpose by his instruments and contentious wavering people. So I'm not quite sure if in theology, medicine and mathematics the true stuff opposes itself. I'm not quite sure what that's supposed to mean. But it's saying the old enemy, this idea of like, you know, the devil or some force which distracts people all the time, and so they never really dig into themselves in any way, you know, by this devil's subtlety and craft, shows himself in hindering every good purpose by his instruments and contentious wavering people, the people who are actually kind of stirring up the trouble, and then the fact that the people who are kind of neutral themselves can't really get it together to go deep enough to understand the world and to read the Liber M. So having had these two paragraphs of the introduction, we get into the story itself. And that's the story of this highly illuminated father, our brother, CRC, a German, the chief and original of our fraternity. So I think that can wait for another program. I'm traveling at the moment, but soon we'll get into this highly illuminated father and his whole story, and we'll see the allegory inside of it and what it's really pointing at and that kind of thing. I do recommend, if you're interested, to read Fama Fraternitatis. You know, it is quite obscure. I think it does help to have some level of interpretation. So I do recommend The True and Invisible Rosicrucian Order as a book to help do that. And I will be back soon when we will start to look properly at the father's CRC as a young man and his journeys and what it's all about. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Devraj. This is Mysticism in the Body. If you're interested in some of my work, find my books on Amazon and other good platforms. Cheers.